Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Well, I'm going to do something a little bit different for the sermon today. It's not going to be just me. It's actually going to be me and Sally together doing most of the sermon today. It's kind of in honor of the fact that we just came through Purim. I'd like to share something very special with you. So Purim, just like every holiday as we go through this period of the pandemic, has an extra significance, doesn't it? We read the Megillah, we read this story of dark times, of frightening times, times we don't know who's going to live and who's going to die, and yet somehow we made it through, we lived, we survived, so we have a party. There's a beautiful wisdom to that. Because life, let's face it, whether it's a pandemic or whatever else that can happen in life, you never know. So as Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav most famously taught, he said, mitzvah gedola lihiyot besimcha tamid. That you have to be besimcha, it's the greatest mitzvah always, to be besimcha, to be joyful, to be happy. Tamid, always. It's quite an extraordinary teaching, isn't it, to say that you're supposed to be happy all the time. I don't know about you, but I certainly fail at that mitzvah. I definitely am not happy all the time. So what is going on here? Why did Rabbi Nachman teach that the greatest mitzvah is to be besimcha all the time? Tamid. Well, we get an interesting insight when we think about this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, we read about the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, which is symbolized by this thing, which I hope I'm pointing at it because I'm pointing at a green screen, but that's right there behind me, which is the eternal light, which of course stood for the eternal light that was in the Mishkan, in the wanderings of the Israelites, and it was in the temple in Jerusalem as well. One of the things that the Meshech Chochmah points out about that is that, you know, the truth is the light itself wasn't seen by everybody. It was actually inside the precincts of the tent and of the temple. So why have a light going constantly inside when not everybody could always see it? And the Meshech Chochmah explains something very powerful. He says the light was for Moses' sake, because Moses had to go in and somehow, no matter what was going on, all of the tsuris that was always happening with the Israelites, when he walked into that tent, he needed to be entirely in the presence of God, and he needed to be able to find God in order to speak to God and to hear what God had to say. So that Ner Tamid was always there because, as the Meshech Chochmah says, it represents simcha, it represents joy. That reminding him that that light is tamid, it's always there. Even if he gets caught up in the craziness and in the uncertainties and insecurities of wandering through 40 years in the wilderness, the Ner Tamid is Simcha Tamid. It's always there. And once he could find that Simcha, he was able to find God. And so we can understand this a little bit better, what we mean and what the Rabbi Nachman means and Meshech Chochmah means by the word Simcha. Simcha doesn't actually mean happy. Simcha means joy. And there's a big difference between happiness and joy. Happiness, even the word happiness in English is related to the word happenstance. It just kind of happens sometimes, right? Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're not. Joy, on the other hand, is a state of being. It's a way to live your life, knowing, even when times seem dark, even when God's face seems to be hidden, somewhere that light, that joy is always there. That joy, you always have access to that somewhere. You just have to know how to look for it. That's besimcha tamid. That's the Ner Tamid. That's what that light behind me is always reminding all of us now. That joy is always there. And in honor of this message, I now would like to share a Hasidic story that was told by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, the very guy who taught us mitzvah gedola lihiyot besimcha tamid. And it's on my screen. Right next to me, I have a Yiddish cobbler. You see, she's wearing the cobbler shoemaker hat. And I couldn't find a crown. But I'm wearing an imaginary crown because I'm the king. So the story is called The King and the Cobbler, the Shoemaker. You ready, Sally? Here we go. There was once a king who loved nothing better than to go out alone in the clothes of a commoner. He wanted to meet the ordinary people of his kingdom, to learn their way of life, and especially their way of thinking about the world. One night, this king found himself walking in the poorest, narrowest street of the city. This was the street of the Jews. He heard a song in the distance. The king thought, a song sung in this place of poverty must be a lament. But as he got closer, he could hear the true character of the song. It was a song of pride.
Yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yalla da 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 da, yay da da da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da da da.
The king was drawn to the source of this song, the smallest, humblest shack on that street. He knocked on the door. Is a stranger welcome here? The voice from within said,
A stranger is God's gift. Come here. Come on in.
in the dim light inside, the king saw a man sitting on the only piece of furniture, a wooden box. When the king came in, the man stood up and sat on the floor, offering the king the crate for a seat. Well, my friend, the king asked, what do you do to earn a living?
Oh, I'm a cobbler.
Oh, you have a shop where you make shoes?
Oh, no, I can't afford the shop. I take my box of tools. Hey, you're sitting on it over there. To the side of the road. There I repair shoes for the peoples as they need them.
You cobble shoes by the side of the road? Can you make enough money? Can you earn a living that way?
Every day I make just enough money to buy food for that day.
The cobbler spoke with both pride and humility. And then the king said, just enough for one day? Aren't you afraid that one day you won't make enough and then you'll go hungry?
Baruch Hashem, yom yom. Blessed be God day by day.
The next day, the king determined to put this man's philosophy to the test. He issued a proclamation that anyone wishing to cobble shoes by the side of the road must purchase a license for 50 pieces of gold. That night, the king returned to the street of the Jews. Again, he heard a song in the distance and thought, this time the cobbler will be singing a different tune. But when the king neared the house, he heard the cobbler sing the same song. Worse, it was even longer, with a new phrase that soared joyfully.
Yay da 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 la la, yay da 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 da, ya la 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 la, yay da da da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, ya la 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 la, yay da da da, yay da ya la la, yay da 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 da, ya la la. Yay da da da, yay da yay da da, yay da 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 da, yay da ya la la, yay da da da.
The king knocked on the door. Oh, my friend, I heard about that wicked king and his proclamation. I was so worried about you. Were you not able to eat today?
Oh, I was angry. I was very angry when I heard I couldn't make a living the way I always have. But I knew I am entitled to make a living and I'm going to find a way. As I stood there saying those very words to myself, a group of people passed by. When I asked them where they were going, they told me into the forest to gather firewood. Every day, they bring back wood to sell as kindling. When I asked if I could join them, they said, there's a whole forest out there, come along. And so I gathered firewood. At the end of the day, I was able to sell it for just enough money to buy food for that day.
The king was flabbergasted. He sputtered, just enough for one day? What about tomorrow? What about the next week?
Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom. Blessed be God day by day.
The next day, the king returned to his throne and issued a new proclamation. Anyone caught gathering firewood in the royal forest would be inducted into the royal guard. For good measure, he issued another. No new members of the royal guard would be paid for 40 days. That night, the king returned to the street of the Jews. Amazed, he heard the same song, but now it had a third part that was militant and determined.
Yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yalla la la da 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 da, yay da da da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da da da, yay da yay da da, yay da 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 da, yay da yay da da, yay da da da, yay. Oh, yay, day, 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 ya la 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 la, day, 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 ya la 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 la, la, ya la 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 la, la, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da.
The king knocked on the door. Cobbler, cobbler, what happened to you today?
Oi, they made me stand at attention all day in the royal guard. They issued me a sword and a scabbard. But then they told me I wouldn't be paid for 40 days.
Oh, my friend, I almost said oi, but I'm not Jewish. Oh, my friend, I bet you wish now that you had saved some money.
Well, let me tell you what I did. At the end of the day, I looked at that metal sword blade. I thought to myself, that must be valuable. So I removed the blade from the handle and fashioned another blade made of wood. When the sword is in the scabbard, no one can tell the difference. So I took the metal blade to a pawnbroker down the street, and I pawned it for just enough money to buy food for 1 day.
The king, needless to say, was stunned. What if there's a sword inspection tomorrow?
Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom, blessed is God day by day.
The next day, the cobbler was pulled out of line in the king's guard. He was presented with a prisoner in chains. Cobbler, this man has committed a horrible crime. You are to take him to the square. Using your sword, you are to behead him.
Behead him? Oy vavoy, I'm an observant Jew. I couldn't take another human life.
If you do not, we will kill both of you. The cobbler led this poor, trembling man into the square where a crowd had gathered to watch the execution. The cobbler put the prisoner's head on the chopping block. He stood tall, his hand on the handle of his sword. Facing the people, the cobbler spoke.
Let God be my witness. I am no murderer. If this man is guilty as charged, let my sword be as always. But, if he is innocent, let my sword turn into wood.
He pulled out his sword. The people gasped when they saw the wooden blade. They bowed down at the great miracle that had happened there. The king, who had been watching all of this, came over to the cobbler. He took him by both his hands, looked deep into his eyes, and said, I am the king. I am your friend who has visited you these last nights. I want you to come live with me in the palace and be my advisor. Please teach me how to live like that, 1 day at a time. Then, in front of everyone, the two of them danced and sang.
Yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da da da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da 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 da, yay da da. Yai, rai, 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 rai. Yai, rai, 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 yai, rai, yai, rai, rai. Yai, rai, rai, rai. Yai, rai, yai, rai, rai. Yai, rai, 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 rai. Yai, rai, yai, rai, rai. Yai, rai, rai, rai. Oh, yai, rai, rai, rai. Ya, la, 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 la. Yai, la, 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 la. Yai, rai, rai. Yai, la, 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 la. Ya, ra, rai, 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 rai. Yai, rai, 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 yai, rai, rai.
Vish, a big yasher koach to our amazing cobbler for leading us and teaching us how to live. Baruch Hashem, Yom Yom. I'll only conclude by saying one of the most famous lines in the Megillah that we read the other day was La Yehudim Aita Ora B'Simcha V'Sason Vayikar, that the Jewish people had light, they had joy, they had simcha, and they had honor. And then when we say Havdalah, we say Ken Tehiyeh Lanu. May that simcha, may that light and that joy be our inheritance as well. Yom Yom, each and every day, Tamid. And we all say Amen.